The carriage wheels had not even stopped turning when Duke Edmund Hale felt his stomach twist into a hard knot. 6 black carriages rolled through the gates of Ravensworth Manor, 3 days earlier than promised, carrying the one delegation that could either save his family or destroy it forever. He stood on the front steps in his finest coat, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had turned white, and he tried to remember every single lesson his tutors had ever given him about foreign manners. None of it was enough. He knew that already. The lead carriage door opened, and Ambassador Dario Castellan stepped out, his dark eyes sweeping over the manor, with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Behind him came 4 more officials from the distant kingdom of Calderon, each dressed in deep crimson robes stitched with gold thread, each watching the English household with the sharp, careful attention of people who had traveled far and expected to be treated with total respect. Edmund's steward, a nervous man named George Whitfield, leaned close and whispered, "Your Grace, they were not due until Thursday. We are not ready." "I am aware," Edmund said through clenched teeth. "Smile, George. Smile as if we planned this exact moment." The truth was far worse than George knew. Ravensworth Manor was drowning in debt. The fields had failed for 2 seasons running, the roof of the east wing had begun to leak, and half the household staff had not been paid in over a month. The only hope left was this trade agreement with Calderon, a deal that would open new markets for English wool and bring desperately needed gold into the estate's empty coffers. If Edmund failed to impress this delegation, if he made even one clumsy mistake, the agreement would collapse, and with it, everything his family had built for 3 generations. He stepped forward and extended his hand toward the ambassador, the way any English gentleman would greet an honored guest. Ambassador Castellan looked at the offered hand for a long, uncomfortable moment, then turned his gaze away entirely, as though the gesture had not happened at all. A ripple of confusion passed through the small crowd of servants gathered near the steps. Edmund felt heat rise in his face. He had no idea what he had done wrong, only that he had clearly done something. "Perhaps," Castellan said in careful, accented English, "Your Grace does not know our customs. In Calderon, a hand is offered only between equals who have already shared bread together. To offer it before that moment is seen as a claim of false familiarity. Some among my people would consider it an insult." Edmund lowered his hand slowly, his mind racing for something, anything, to say that might repair the damage. "My deepest apologies, Ambassador. I meant only welcome, not offense." "Of course," Castellan replied, his tone polite but distant. "We shall see how the rest of your welcome unfolds." The delegation was led inside, and Edmund followed a few steps behind, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He caught George's eye and gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent message that said everything was already falling apart. George's face went pale. Inside the great hall, the household staff had prepared refreshments in the English fashion, small cakes and tea served in delicate porcelain cups. Castellan's youngest attendant, a thin man with sharp cheekbones, took one look at the tea tray and murmured something in his own language to the official beside him. The 2 of them exchanged a glance that was unmistakably one of disappointment. Edmund did not understand a word of what was said, but he understood the look on their faces perfectly well. Whatever tradition governed a proper welcome in Calderon, tea and cakes were clearly not part of it. He excused himself for a moment, claiming a need to check on the guest chambers, and hurried down the corridor with George close behind him. Once they were out of earshot, Edmund turned on his steward with barely controlled desperation in his voice. "George, tell me the truth. Do we have anyone in this household, anyone at all, who understands the customs of Calderon? Anyone who speaks their language?" George wrung his hands together. "Your Grace, I have asked everyone. The tutors know Latin and French. The cook knows nothing beyond English recipes. We have no one. There must be someone. Think, George. Think of every person who has ever set foot on this estate." George hesitated, and that hesitation caught Edmund's attention immediately. "There is someone," George said slowly, "but you will not like the suggestion, Your Grace." "I do not care whether I like it. Tell me." "Ilara Voss," George said, almost in a whisper, as though the name itself carried some kind of danger. "She lived in Calderon as a child, before her family returned to England. She speaks the language, she knows their customs. But Your Grace, you know what happened. The scandal. The entire county turned against her. Inviting her here, especially now, in front of foreign guests, it could bring more shame upon this house, not less." Edmund's jaw tightened at the mention of her name. He remembered the scandal well, though he had never learned the full truth of it, only the whispers that had followed Ilara Voss for years, whispers that painted her as reckless, disgraced, unworthy of polite company. He had never spoken to her himself, had only seen her from a distance once or twice, a quiet figure walking alone at the edge of the estate, avoided by everyone who crossed her path. "Is there truly no other option?" Edmund asked, though he already suspected the answer. "None, Your Grace. Not one person in this entire household or the surrounding villages knows anything of Calderon beyond what little we have read in old books, and those books are decades out of date." Edmund closed his eyes for a moment, weighing pride against necessity, weighing the fear of scandal against the far greater fear of losing everything his family had ever owned. The ambassador and his officials were waiting in the great hall at this very moment, likely forming judgments that would be impossible to undo. Every second of hesitation made the situation worse. "Send for her," Edmund said finally, his voice low but firm. "Send for her now, before I change my mind." George's eyes widened in surprise, but he did not argue. He gave a quick bow and hurried off toward the stables, calling for the fastest rider on the estate. Edmund returned to the great hall with a composed face, though his mind was anywhere but calm. He engaged the ambassador in careful conversation, choosing his words with great caution, watching for any flicker of displeasure that might signal another mistake. Castellan spoke of the long journey from Calderon, of the mountains they had crossed and the rivers they had followed, but his tone remained guarded, his warmth nowhere to be found. One of the other officials, a stern woman named Lady Iseult, studied the tapestries on the walls with open curiosity, then turned to Edmund with a question that caught him completely off guard. "Your Grace, in Calderon, it is tradition that a host reveals something of his family's history before any business is discussed. Will you share the story of your family's crest with us?" Edmund glanced at the tapestry behind him, an old and faded depiction of a raven perched on a sword, and realized with a sinking feeling that he did not actually know the full story behind it. His grandfather had commissioned it, that much he knew, but the meaning behind the symbols had been lost somewhere in the passing generations. "The raven," he began, choosing his words carefully, "represents watchfulness. The sword represents defense of the family's honor." Lady Iseult tilted her head slightly, and Edmund could not tell whether his answer had satisfied her or simply confirmed some quiet suspicion she already held. The silence that followed felt endless. Just as Edmund searched for something more to say, a servant appeared at the entrance of the hall and gave a small, urgent nod toward George, who stood near the doorway. George slipped away quietly, and Edmund understood the signal at once. Elara Voss had arrived, or was about to. He excused himself once again, this time claiming urgent estate business, and stepped out into the corridor where George waited with visible relief on his face. "She is here, Your Grace. She came the moment she received the message." Edmund felt a strange mixture of hope and dread settle over him. He had summoned help from a woman the entire county had rejected, a woman whose name alone stirred discomfort in every room she entered. If she failed to help him, or worse, if her presence somehow made things worse, he would have no one else to turn to. "Bring her to the study," Edmund said, quietly. "I do not want the guest to see her yet, not until I understand exactly what she can offer." George nodded and hurried off again. Edmund stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, staring down the empty hallway toward the great hall where the fate of his family's estate hung in careful, fragile balance. He thought of his father, who had built much of what remained of Ravensworth's fortune, and of his mother, who had passed years ago believing the estate would remain strong for generations to come. He thought of the servants who depended on this household for their livelihoods, of the tenant farmers whose futures were tied to whatever agreement might or might not be reached in the coming days. Everything rested now on a single decision he had just made in a moment of desperation, a decision to trust a woman he did not know, a woman the world had cast aside without mercy. He walked toward the study with slow, deliberate steps, uncertain whether he had just saved his family's future or made a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his life. When he reached the study door, he paused with his hand resting on the handle, listening to the quiet murmur of voices drifting from the great hall behind him, foreign words he could not understand, spoken by guests he could not afford to lose. He took a breath, steadied himself, and pushed the door open, ready to face whatever waited for him inside. Elara Voss stood in the center of the study, her hands folded calmly in front of her, wearing a plain gray dress that had clearly been mended more than once. She did not look nervous, though Edmund suspected she had every reason to be. Word traveled fast in a household this size, and by now every servant in the manor likely knew that the disgraced woman from the edge of the estate had been summoned inside the walls she had been forbidden to enter for years. "Your Grace," she said, offering a small, careful bow. Her voice was steady, controlled, giving away nothing of whatever she might have been feeling underneath. Edmund studied her for a moment before speaking. He had expected someone diminished by years of rejection, someone timid or bitter. Instead, he found a woman whose calm bearing reminded him faintly of the ambassador himself, the same quiet control, the same careful watchfulness in the eyes. "Miss Voss," he said, "I understand you spent part of your childhood in Calderon." "I did, Your Grace. My father served as a merchant there for nearly 9 years. I left when I was 16. "And you speak their language?" "Fluently. I also know their customs, though I imagine much has changed in the years since I lived there." Edmund exhaled slowly, allowing himself the smallest flicker of relief. "I will be honest with you, Miss Voss, because we do not have time for anything less. The delegation currently sitting in my great hall holds the future of this estate in their hands. I have already made 2 mistakes since their arrival. Mistakes I did not even know I was making until it was too late. If I do not correct course quickly, the agreement we hope to sign will collapse, and with it, everything my family has built." "What mistakes have you made, Your Grace?" I offered my hand to the ambassador as a greeting. He informed me that such a gesture, before sharing a meal together, suggests a false claim of familiarity. And moments ago, one of his officials asked me to explain the story behind my family's crest, a tradition I did not know existed, and I fear my answer sounded hollow and unprepared. Alara's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "The hand gesture is a common misunderstanding, Your Grace. Many English hosts make that same mistake, and it can usually be repaired with the right words at the right moment. As for the story of the crest, that tradition is called the telling of roots. In Calderon, no business is ever discussed until the host has shared something true and personal about his family. It is meant to build trust before any negotiation begins. If your answer felt hollow, it is likely because they sensed you were reciting words rather than sharing something real." Edmund felt a chill of understanding settle over him. "Then I have already damaged their trust." "Not beyond repair," Alara said, "but it will require careful work to rebuild it, and very little time to do so. Will you help me, Miss Voss? I know what has been said about you in this county. I know most doors in Ravensworth have been closed to you for years, and I understand if you have no reason to help a household that has never once defended you against those rumors. But I am asking regardless, because I have no one else to turn to." For a long moment, Ilara said nothing at all. Edmund watched her carefully, wondering if she might refuse simply out of quiet resentment, a resentment she would have every right to feel. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, and met his eyes directly. "I will help you, Your Grace, not because this household has been kind to me, because it has not. I will help, because my father always believed that knowledge should never be wasted, no matter how it is received. And because the tenant families on this estate depend on its survival just as much as your own family does. Their futures should not suffer because of decisions that were never theirs to make." Edmund felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the carriages first rolled through the gates. "Thank you, Miss Voss, truly. Do not thank me yet, Your Grace. We have a great deal of work ahead of us, and very little time to accomplish it. Tell me everything about this delegation, their names, their titles, anything you have observed since their arrival." Edmund quickly described the ambassador and his 3 officials, repeating as closely as he could the exact words that had been exchanged since their arrival. Alara listened without interrupting, her brow furrowing slightly at certain details, nodding at others. "The woman who asked about your family's crest, Lady Iseult. She holds a position of great importance in Calderon's court, more important than her title suggests. She is likely testing you far more than the ambassador himself. If you can win her trust, the ambassador will follow her judgment more than his own instincts." "How do I win her trust?" "By being honest, Your Grace, truly honest, not merely polite. The story you tell about your family does not need to be grand or impressive. It needs only to be true. Do you know any real story connected to that crest, something personal, something that happened to your own family rather than simply the meaning of the symbols themselves?" Edmund thought for a long moment, searching through old memories, half-forgotten conversations with his grandfather from many years ago. Slowly, a memory surfaced, one he had not thought about in years. "My grandfather told me once that the raven was chosen because during a terrible storm, a raven led one of our ancestors to shelter when he was lost and near death on the moors. The sword was added generations later, after that same family successfully defended the estate from raiders. It is a simple story, nothing grand. It is exactly the kind of story they will value," Alara said. "Simple, true, personal. Tell it exactly as you told it to me, without embellishment. That honesty will matter far more to Lady Iseult than any elaborate tale you might invent." "There is something else," Edmund said, a new worry surfacing. "The tea and cakes we served upon their arrival. I saw the younger official exchange a look with someone else, and it was clearly a look of disappointment." Elara's expression grew more serious. In Calderon, the first meal shared with guests carries deep meaning. It is called the joining table, and it typically includes bread, salt, and a shared cup of wine, passed between host and guest as a symbol of trust. Tea and cakes, however lovely by English standards, would seem thin and impersonal to them, almost as though you did not consider them worthy of a proper welcome. Edmund's stomach tightened further. Then I have made yet another mistake. It can still be corrected, Your Grace, but it must happen soon, before the evening meal takes place. I would suggest arranging a proper joining table before dinner this evening. Bread, salt, and wine, presented personally by your own hands rather than through servants. That gesture alone may repair much of the damage already done. Edmund nodded quickly, already turning toward the study door to summon the kitchen staff. I will arrange it immediately. Will you join us for the evening meal, Miss Voss? I fear I will need your guidance close at hand, not simply advice given in private beforehand. Elara hesitated for the first time since entering the study. Your Grace, my presence at your table will raise questions among your other guests and your household staff. The county has not looked kindly upon me for years. Are you certain you wish to invite that kind of attention during such an important evening? I am certain, Edmund said, more firmly than he expected himself to sound. Whatever the county believes about you, right now you are the only person capable of preventing this negotiation from collapsing entirely. I would rather face uncomfortable questions than lose everything my family has built because I was too concerned with appearances. Something shifted subtly in Elara's expression, though Edmund could not quite identify what it was. Perhaps surprise, perhaps something closer to cautious trust. Very well, Your Grace. I will join you this evening, but you must introduce me carefully, as someone assisting with matters of foreign custom, nothing more. If the delegation senses any tension surrounding my presence, it may create new complications rather than solving the ones we already face. Understood, Edmund said. I will introduce you exactly as you suggest. Elara moved toward the door, then paused and turned back toward him. Your Grace, may I ask something directly? Of course. Why did you truly send for me? Knowing what has been said about me throughout this county, George Whitfield could have told you that inviting me here would cause talk among your staff and your neighbors. Many men in your position would have preferred to risk the negotiation rather than risk that talk. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering. Because I have watched this estate slowly fall apart over these last 2 years, Miss Voss, and I have grown tired of choosing appearances over survival. If Ravensworth collapses because I cared more about what the county whispers than about the people who depend on this land, I do not believe I could forgive myself for that choice. I would rather be criticized for asking for your help than watch everything my family has built disappear because pride kept me silent. Elara studied him for a long moment, as though weighing something carefully in her mind. That is a rare kind of honesty from a man in your position, Your Grace. Perhaps, Edmund said, or perhaps it is simply desperation dressed in honest words. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Elara's mouth, the first hint of warmth Edmund had seen from her since she entered the room. Desperation has led wiser men to worse decisions, Your Grace. I do not think you should discount the honesty simply because necessity brought it forward. She left the study to prepare herself for the evening ahead, and Edmund immediately summoned George to arrange the joining table exactly as Elara had described: bread, salt, and wine, prepared with careful attention and presented personally rather than through distant servants. As the household staff scrambled to prepare everything correctly, Edmund found himself thinking not only of the delegation waiting in his great hall, but of the woman who had just walked out of his study, a woman the entire county had rejected without mercy, now the only person standing between his family and complete ruin. He returned to the great hall to find the ambassador and his officials still seated, their expressions still carefully guarded, their patience visibly wearing thin. Edmund took a slow breath, steadied his nerves, and prepared to face the evening that would determine everything. The great hall had been transformed by the time evening arrived. Long tables were dressed with simple linen, and at the center of each place setting sat a small wooden bowl of salt, a round loaf of fresh bread, and a single cup meant to be shared rather than individually poured. Edmund had insisted the household staff prepare everything exactly as Elara described, down to the smallest detail, and now he stood near the entrance of the hall, watching the delegation file in with careful, unreadable expressions. Ambassador Castellan paused when he saw the arrangement, his eyes moving slowly across the table before settling briefly on Edmund. For the first time since his arrival, something like genuine curiosity flickered across his face. Your Grace, Castellan said, this is unexpected. I hope it is a welcome surprise, Ambassador, Edmund replied, keeping his voice steady despite the nervous energy running through his chest. I understand that our earlier welcome fell short of your traditions, and I wish to correct that before the evening progressed further. Lady Iseult stepped forward and examined the bread and salt with obvious interest. Who informed you of the joining table, Your Grace? Few in England know of this tradition. Before Edmund could answer, Elara entered the hall, dressed simply but neatly, her posture composed despite the sudden weight of attention that fell upon her the moment she crossed the threshold. Whispers rippled through the servants standing near the walls, and Edmund caught sight of several household staff exchanging startled glances. Ambassador Castellan, Lady Iseult, Edmund said, gesturing toward Elara. Allow me to introduce Miss Elara Voss, who has generously agreed to assist us in matters of Calderon custom during your visit. Castellan studied Elara carefully, and after a long moment, he spoke a few words in his own language. Elara answered fluently, her accent smooth and unhesitating, and Edmund watched the ambassador's eyebrows lift slightly in genuine surprise. She speaks our language as though she were born among us, Castellan said, switching back to English, his tone noticeably warmer than before. I lived in Calderon as a child, Ambassador, Elara said, offering a respectful bow. Though many years have passed since I called it home, I have not forgotten what I learned there. Lady Iseult's sharp eyes moved between Elara and Edmund, clearly reassessing the situation before her. And it was your guidance, Miss Voss, that led to this joining table being prepared? It was my suggestion, Lady Iseult, but the effort belongs entirely to His Grace and his household. I merely explained the tradition. He chose to honor it. Edmund felt a flicker of gratitude toward Elara for the careful way she framed the moment, giving him credit rather than allowing the delegation to believe he had simply been guided through every step without understanding or effort of his own. It was a small kindness, but one that mattered greatly in a room where every word was being weighed and measured. The delegation took their seats, and Edmund followed Elara's earlier instructions precisely. He broke the bread himself, offering the first piece to Ambassador Castellan with both hands, a gesture Elara had explained represented equal respect between host and guest. He then sprinkled a small pinch of salt onto each guest's palm, another gesture meant to symbolize shared hardship and mutual trust. Finally, he lifted the shared cup of wine and drank first, before passing it to Castellan, who accepted it with a slow, deliberate nod. You have done your research well, Your Grace, Castellan said as the cup passed around the table. Or perhaps I should say, you have found excellent guidance. Both, Ambassador, Edmund replied honestly, though I confess the guidance has been essential. Lady Iseult turned her attention toward Edmund directly. Your Grace, earlier today I asked you to share the story behind your family's crest, and your answer felt, if you will forgive my honesty, somewhat rehearsed. Would you care to share it again, now that the joining table has been properly honored? Edmund felt his pulse quicken, but this time he remembered Elara's advice clearly. Simple, true, personal. He took a breath and began again. My grandfather told me that generations ago, one of our ancestors became lost during a terrible storm on the moors near this very estate. He had lost his horse, lost his sense of direction, and believed he would not survive the night. A single raven appeared through the storm and seemed to guide him, flying just ahead of him through the darkness, until he finally found shelter in a shepherd's hut. He never forgot that raven, and when he later became head of this household, he had it placed upon our family crest as a reminder that guidance sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that pride should never prevent a man from following help when he desperately needs it. The hall fell quiet for a moment. Lady Iseult's expression softened slightly, something genuine replacing the careful scrutiny she had shown earlier. That is a fine story, Your Grace, she said, and fitting, given the circumstances of this very evening. Edmund glanced briefly at Elara, who kept her eyes lowered respectfully, though he noticed the faint curve of satisfaction at the corner of her mouth. The story had landed exactly as she predicted it would. The evening continued, and gradually the tension that had gripped the hall since the delegation's arrival began to ease. Castellan spoke more freely of his homeland, of the mountains surrounding Calderon's capital, of the rivers that fed its rich farmlands. Elara translated occasional phrases when Castellan lapsed briefly into his native tongue, and more than once she offered small clarifications that prevented misunderstandings before they could take root. At one point, the youngest official, a serious young man named Farron, asked Edmund a question about English farming methods, clearly attempting to understand what kind of wool production Ravensworth could realistically offer under a new trade agreement. Edmund answered as best he could, but when the conversation turned toward specific numbers and terms that required Calderon's particular business customs, he found himself faltering. Elara leaned slightly toward him and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. They value directness in business discussions, Your Grace, but only after trust has been established through personal connection, which we have begun tonight. Do not attempt precise numbers this evening. Suggest instead that detailed discussions take place tomorrow, once everyone has rested from their journey. Rushing the numbers tonight, before trust is fully settled, may seem as though you are eager to secure an advantage rather than build a fair partnership. Edmund nodded subtly and turned back toward Farron. I would prefer, if it pleases your delegation, that we discuss the finer details of any agreement tomorrow, once you have had proper rest after such a long journey. Tonight, I would rather we simply come to know one another. Farron glanced toward Castellan, who gave a small approving nod. A wise choice, Your Grace. Business discussed too quickly often collapses under its own haste. As the evening wore on, Edmund noticed a subtle shift in how the delegation regarded him, a warmth that had been entirely absent upon their arrival earlier that day. He also noticed how often their eyes moved toward Alara with quiet respect, a respect she had earned within a matter of hours, despite the reputation that had followed her for years throughout the county. Near the end of the meal, Lady Iseult addressed Alara directly. Miss Voss, you clearly understand our customs with a depth that surprises me. Tell me, what became of your family after you left Calderon? A flicker of something passed across Alara's face, quickly hidden beneath her composed expression. My father's business ventures did not prosper upon our return to England, Lady Iseult. He passed away several years ago, and I have lived quietly since then, managing on what little remained. And yet the county speaks poorly of you, Your Grace tells me, Lady Iseult said, turning her sharp gaze toward Edmund. I find that difficult to reconcile with the woman sitting before us this evening. Edmund felt the weight of the moment settle heavily upon him. He had not expected the conversation to turn in this direction, and he glanced quickly at Alara, uncertain how she wished him to respond. The county's judgments are not always fair, Lady Iseult, Edmund said carefully. I have learned this evening that I placed far too much trust in rumors I never bothered to question myself. Alara said nothing, but Edmund noticed her shoulders relax slightly, as though his words had offered some small measure of relief she had not expected to receive. Lady Iseult studied them both for a long moment before returning her attention to her meal, apparently satisfied, at least for the time being. As the evening finally drew to a close and the delegation retired to their guest chambers, Edmund walked with Alara toward the study once more, both of them exhausted but relieved that the disaster of the morning had been at least partially repaired. You did well tonight, Your Grace, Alara said as they reached the study door. Better than you likely believe yourself. I did nothing without your guidance, Miss Voss. Every correction, every word, came from you. Perhaps, Alara said, but you were the one who chose to listen, and the one who chose honesty over pride when Lady Iseult questioned you directly. Not every man in your position would have made that same choice. Edmund studied her for a moment, curiosity rising within him despite the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. May I ask you something in return, Miss Voss? You may. What truly happened, all those years ago, the scandal that turned this entire county against you? I have heard only rumors, never the truth. Alara's expression grew guarded, though not unkind. That is a longer story than we have time for tonight, Your Grace, and tomorrow brings its own difficulties that will require both our full attention. Perhaps, if the negotiation succeeds, there will be time enough to share it properly. Edmund nodded, respecting the boundary she had drawn, though his curiosity remained far from satisfied. Then I will wait until you are ready to share it, Miss Voss, and I thank you again, sincerely, for everything you have done today. Do not thank me yet, Your Grace, Alara said, echoing her earlier words from that morning. Tomorrow will test us both, far more than tonight has. She left the study, and Edmund remained behind for a long while, staring at the dying embers in the hearth, wondering what tomorrow's negotiations would bring, and wondering too about the quiet, guarded woman who had walked back into his life at the exact moment he needed her most. Morning arrived with a sharp autumn chill, and Edmund found himself standing outside the manor before the sun had fully risen, watching mist curl low across the fields where his tenant farmers would soon begin their day's work. He had barely slept, his mind circling endlessly around the negotiation ahead, around numbers and terms he did not fully understand, around the fragile trust built so carefully the night before that could still shatter with a single misstep. Alara arrived earlier than expected, already dressed and composed, carrying a small leather satchel filled with notes she had prepared through the night. Edmund noticed the shadows beneath her eyes, and realized she likely had not slept either. You did not need to arrive so early, Miss Voss, Edmund said as she approached. The negotiation begins in a matter of hours, Your Grace, and there is still much you do not know. I spent the night preparing what I could, but some of it you must understand yourself. I cannot stand beside you and whisper every word during formal business discussions. That would undermine you far more than it would help. Edmund nodded, recognizing the truth in her words even as anxiety tightened further in his chest. Then tell me everything I need to know. They walked together toward the study, and Alara spread her notes across the desk, explaining patiently and thoroughly the structure of Calderon's business customs. She explained that negotiations typically unfolded in 3 stages: an opening exchange of respectful terms, a middle stage of direct bargaining, where both sides would test each other's limits, and a closing stage, where final terms were sealed, not merely with signatures but with a spoken oath repeated by both parties. The middle stage will be the most dangerous for you, Your Grace, Alara explained. Castellan will likely test your resolve by proposing terms that favor Calderon heavily, not because he expects you to accept them, but to see how you respond under pressure. If you accept too quickly, he will conclude you are desperate and continue pushing for more. If you refuse too harshly, he will conclude you are prideful and unwilling to compromise. You must find the careful middle ground, firm but respectful, confident but not arrogant. And how do I find that middle ground, precisely? By remembering the same principle from last night, Your Grace. Honesty, delivered with confidence rather than desperation. If a term truly does not serve your estate's survival, say so plainly, and explain why, using specific reasoning rather than simply refusing outright. Castellan respects reasoning far more than he respects flat refusal. Edmund absorbed everything she told him, asking question after question as the morning light slowly strengthened outside the study window. Alara answered each one patiently, occasionally sharing small stories from her childhood in Calderon that illustrated the customs more vividly than simple explanation ever could. There is one more thing you should know, Your Grace, Alara said, as their preparation drew toward its end. Farron, the younger official, holds more influence than his age suggests. He is Castellan's nephew, and it is widely known within Calderon's court that Castellan is grooming him to eventually take on greater diplomatic responsibility. If you can earn Farron's respect during this negotiation, you may find Castellan far more willing to extend generous terms, both now and in future dealings between our 2 lands. How does one earn Farron's respect specifically? He values practical knowledge above all else. If you can speak knowledgeably about the actual production of your wool, the conditions of your farmland, the realities faced by your tenant farmers, rather than simply reciting figures prepared by an accountant, he will see you as a serious partner, rather than merely a nobleman seeking to profit from an agreement he barely understands. Edmund considered this carefully. He had, in truth, spent a great deal of time over the past 2 difficult years walking his own fields, speaking directly with his tenant farmers, learning firsthand what struggles they faced as the harvests failed. It was knowledge born from necessity rather than choice, but it was knowledge nonetheless, and perhaps it would serve him well today. I believe I can speak to that, Miss Voss. Necessity has taught me more about my own land these past 2 years than any tutor ever did. Then use that knowledge today, Your Grace. Let Farron see that you understand your estate not merely as a title, but as a living thing you have worked to protect. The negotiation began shortly after midday, held in a formal chamber adjoining the Great Hall, where a long table had been arranged with English terms on one side, and, through Alara's careful translation, Calderon's counter-proposals on the other. Ambassador Castellan opened the discussion with measured formality, outlining Calderon's interest in securing a steady supply of English wool at favorable rates, in exchange for access to certain rare goods and materials that England's markets desperately needed. As Alara had predicted, the middle stage of the negotiation grew tense quickly. Castellan proposed terms that would have secured Calderon a significant advantage: wool, at prices far below what Ravensworth's tenant farmers could sustainably produce. Edmund felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the moment Alara had warned him about the night before, the careful test of his resolve. Ambassador, Edmund said, keeping his voice steady and measured, I understand the value Calderon places on securing favorable terms, and I respect the position from which you negotiate. But I must be honest with you. The price you propose would not sustain the farmers who produce this wool. Their fields have already suffered through 2 difficult seasons, and if I accept terms that leave them further impoverished, I will have secured gold for my own estate at the direct expense of the very people whose labor makes this agreement possible at all. I cannot, in good conscience, accept such terms, not because I lack respect for your position, but because I believe a partnership built on the suffering of one side will not endure. Castellan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, while Farron, seated beside his uncle, leaned forward slightly with visible interest. You speak with unusual conviction for a nobleman discussing wool prices, Your Grace, Castellan said finally. I have walked those fields myself these past 2 years, Ambassador. I have spoken with the families who work them. I do not discuss numbers detached from the people behind them. I discuss the survival of my tenants alongside the survival of my own estate, because the two cannot be separated. Farron spoke for the first time since the negotiation began, his voice carrying a seriousness beyond his years. Uncle, if His Grace speaks truthfully about the conditions of his farmland, then the price we proposed may indeed prove unsustainable. A partnership that collapses within 2 seasons serves neither Calderon nor England. Castellan considered his nephew's words carefully, then turned his attention back toward Edmund. Very well, Your Grace. Propose a price you believe would sustain both your farmers and a fair partnership between our lands. Edmund glanced briefly toward Alara, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. He named a figure, carefully calculated based on conversations he had genuinely held with his tenant farmers over recent months, a figure that offered Calderon meaningful value, while still allowing Ravensworth's farmers to recover and rebuild. Castellan studied the proposed figure, murmured something quietly to Lady Iseult in their own language, and after a long, tense pause, gave a slow nod. This figure, Your Grace, seems reasonable. We accept it as the foundation for further discussion. Relief washed through Edmund's chest, though he was careful not to let it show too openly on his face. The negotiation continued through the afternoon, moving through additional terms regarding delivery schedules, quality standards, and the exchange of Calderon's rare goods in return. Alara remained close throughout, offering quiet clarifications whenever cultural misunderstandings threatened to derail the discussion, though as the hours passed, Edmund found himself relying less on her direct guidance and more on the understanding he had built through her earlier teachings. At one point, a disagreement arose regarding the timing of seasonal shipments, a disagreement that grew heated enough that both sides temporarily raised their voices before catching themselves. Alara stepped in smoothly, redirecting the conversation with a suggestion that split the difference between both proposed schedules, framing it in terms that echoed Calderon's own values of mutual benefit, rather than simple compromise. The tension eased almost immediately, and the discussion moved forward once more. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the negotiation chamber, the outline of a full agreement had taken shape, terms that satisfied both sides, without leaving either party feeling as though they had been taken advantage of. Castellan leaned back in his chair, studying Edmund with an expression that had shifted considerably since their tense first meeting the previous day. Your Grace, Castellan said, I confess I arrived at your estate with serious doubts about whether this negotiation would succeed. Your household's unfamiliarity with our customs suggested a lack of preparation that concerned me greatly, yet you have proven yourself far more capable than I initially believed, both in understanding our traditions and in negotiating with genuine conviction rather than empty flattery. I owe a great deal of that capability to Miss Voss, Ambassador, Edmund said honestly. Without her guidance, I would have stumbled far more severely than I did. Castellan turned his gaze toward Alara, studying her with renewed interest. Miss Voss, your knowledge of our customs and your skill in guiding this negotiation have not gone unnoticed. It is rare to find someone in England who understands Calderon as deeply as you clearly do. You are too generous, Ambassador, Alara said, though Edmund noticed a faint color rising in her cheeks, the first genuine sign of emotion she had shown since the negotiation began. Not generous, Miss Voss, simply honest, Castellan replied. I hope, whatever the future holds for this agreement between our lands, that your talents continue to be recognized rather than overlooked. The negotiation chamber grew quiet for a moment, and Edmund found himself studying Alara with a mixture of gratitude and something else entirely, something he could not quite name, though it stirred a warmth in his chest he had not expected to feel amid such high stakes and careful diplomacy. The day's work was not yet finished, but for the first time since the carriages had rolled through his gates, Edmund allowed himself to believe that Ravensworth might truly survive this trial after all. That evening, as the household staff prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final formal dinner before the agreement's official signing, a commotion erupted near the kitchens that sent a fresh wave of alarm through the manor. George Whitfield burst into the study where Edmund and Alara were reviewing the finalized terms one last time, his face pale with panic. Your Grace, there is trouble. Lord Nigel Ashford has arrived uninvited, and he is demanding an audience with the ambassador immediately. Edmund's stomach dropped. Lord Ashford was a neighboring nobleman whose own estate had struggled for years, a man known throughout the county for his sharp tongue and his barely concealed resentment toward Ravensworth's continued survival despite its recent hardships. His sudden, unannounced arrival could mean nothing good. What does he want, George? He would not say precisely, Your Grace, only that he has urgent matters to discuss with the delegation directly, matters he claims concern the honor and reputation of this household. Alara's expression grew tense. Your Grace, If Lord Ashford intends to raise the old scandal surrounding my name in front of the ambassador, it could unravel everything we have built these past 2 days. Calderon values trust and honesty above nearly everything else. If Castellan believes he has been negotiating alongside a household with hidden scandal, or worse, believes you concealed something important from him, the agreement could collapse entirely, even at this final stage. Then we must prevent him from reaching the ambassador, Edmund said, already moving toward the door. But it was too late. By the time Edmund reached the Great Hall, Lord Ashford had already positioned himself directly before Ambassador Castellan, his voice carrying easily across the room despite the ambassador's clear discomfort at the sudden intrusion. "Ambassador Castellan," Ashford was saying, his tone dripping with false concern, "I felt it my duty as a neighboring nobleman to warn you before this agreement proceeds any further. The Duke has brought a disgraced woman into his household to assist your negotiations, a woman cast out by this entire county for reasons of scandal and dishonor. I would hate to see your delegation associated with such tainted company, or worse, misled by information from a source whose credibility the entire region has long since rejected." The hall fell into tense silence. Castellan's eyes moved from Ashford toward Edmund, who had just entered, his expression carefully unreadable, though Edmund could sense the weight of judgment forming behind those dark eyes. "Your Grace," Castellan said slowly, "is there truth to what Lord Ashford suggests?" Before Edmund could respond, Ilara stepped forward from where she had followed close behind him, her chin lifted with quiet, steady resolve. "Ambassador, if you will permit me, I believe it is only fair that I speak for myself, rather than allow rumor to speak on my behalf." Castellan studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "Speak, Miss Voss. I would rather hear truth directly than judge based on second-hand accusation." Ilara turned to face the room fully, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. 6 years ago, I was engaged to be married to a man from a respected family in this county. Shortly before our wedding, he was discovered to have committed serious financial fraud against several local merchants, fraud that ruined more than one family in this region. Rather than face the consequences of his own actions, he fled the county entirely, leaving false letters behind that suggested I had known of his schemes all along and had helped conceal them. I had known nothing. I lost my engagement, my reputation, and nearly everything I had, because a coward chose to protect himself by destroying my name instead. A murmur passed through the hall, servants and household staff exchanging startled glances. Edmund himself felt a fresh wave of anger rise within him, not toward Ilara, but toward the years of unjust rumor that had followed her simply because the truth had been more difficult to uncover than the convenient lie. "I never had the resources or the standing to properly clear my name," Ilara continued, her voice steady though clearly strained by the weight of the memory. "The man responsible was never found, and the county chose to believe the easier story, rather than search for a harder truth. I have lived with that injustice for 6 years, Ambassador, and I did not come here expecting sympathy or vindication. I came because His Grace needed help understanding your customs, and because I believed the survival of this estate mattered more than my own reputation, which had already been ruined, regardless of what I did or did not do." Lord Ashford's confident expression faltered slightly under the weight of the hall's collective attention, though he attempted to recover his composure. "Regardless of the details, Ambassador, the scandal remains a matter of public record throughout this county, and I felt it my duty to ensure your delegation was not deceived by—" "Lord Ashford," Castellan interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding in a way it had not been throughout the entire negotiation. "In Calderon, we hold a particular disdain for men who arrive uninvited to a household not their own, seeking to damage the reputation of a woman who has done nothing this evening but serve with honesty and skill. I have negotiated alongside Miss Voss for 2 full days, and I have found her guidance impeccable, her honesty unwavering, and her knowledge of my homeland deeper than I expected to find anywhere in England. Whatever occurred 6 years ago, I judge people by what I witness with my own eyes, not by rumors passed secondhand through a county eager for gossip." Ashford's face reddened with barely contained frustration, but before he could offer any further protest, Castellan continued, his tone leaving no room for further argument. "I would ask that you leave this household now, Lord Ashford. Your presence here was uninvited, and your purpose in coming appears to have been to damage rather than assist. I have no further interest in hearing from you this evening." For a long, tense moment, Ashford stood frozen, clearly unprepared for such a direct rebuke from a foreign ambassador whose approval he had not anticipated needing at all. Finally, with a stiff, resentful bow, he turned and left the hall, his footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floor until the great doors closed behind him. The hall remained quiet for a moment longer before Castellan turned his attention back toward Ilara, His expression softened considerably from the sharp authority he had shown moments before. "Miss Voss, I am sorry that such an injustice has followed you for so many years. In Calderon, we believe that truth eventually finds its way to light, however long it takes. I hope, in time, that proves true for you as well." "Thank you, Ambassador," Ilara said quietly, though Edmund could see genuine emotion glistening in her eyes, emotion she had clearly kept carefully guarded for a very long time. Edmund stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Miss Voss, I owe you an apology as well. I should have asked you the truth of what happened long before tonight, rather than allowing you to carry the burden of a rumor, unchallenged within my own household for years. I regret that I did not seek the truth sooner." Ilara turned toward him, and for the first time since their initial meeting in the study, her composed guard seemed to fully lower, revealing something far more vulnerable underneath. "You could not have known, Your Grace. Few ever bothered to ask. Then I am asking now, and I intend to correct that failure, not only tonight but going forward. This county has wronged you for 6 years based on a lie, and I do not intend to remain silent about that injustice any longer." The room seemed to hold its breath at the weight of his words, servants and officials alike sensing that something significant had shifted, not only in the negotiation between two distant lands, but in the quiet, careful trust building between the Duke and the woman the entire county had once rejected without mercy. Later that evening, once the delegation had retired and the household had finally settled into an uneasy quiet following the dramatic confrontation, Edmund found Ilara standing alone near the manor's garden, gazing out at the darkened fields beyond. "You did not have to defend me so publicly, Your Grace," she said without turning as he approached. "It would have been simpler to let the matter pass quietly." "Perhaps," Edmund said, coming to stand beside her, "but I find I have grown tired of simple, quiet injustices, Miss Voss. Especially ones that have cost someone as capable as yourself 6 years of unwarranted suffering." Ilara finally turned to face him, her expression difficult to read in the dim evening light. 6 years is a long time to carry something you did not choose, Your Grace." "Then let us ensure it does not remain 6 years longer," Edmund said firmly. "Tomorrow, once the agreement is formally signed, I intend to make a public statement clearing your name before the entire county, using whatever influence this household still commands. You deserve far more than quiet vindication whispered behind closed doors." For a long moment, Ilara said nothing, simply studying him with an expression that carried both surprise and something gentler, something that had not been present in her guarded eyes since she first entered the study 2 days earlier. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice softer than Edmund had yet heard it. "Truly." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the last light fade over the fields that Ilara's careful guidance had helped secure a future for, both of them aware that tomorrow would bring not only the formal signing of an agreement between two distant lands, but perhaps the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find within the walls of Ravensworth Manor. The morning of the signing arrived bright and clear, a welcome change from the tense gray skies that had hung over Ravensworth since the delegation's arrival. Servants moved briskly through the manor, preparing the great hall for the formal ceremony, while word of the previous evening's confrontation had already spread through the household and beyond, carried quickly by servants who had witnessed Lord Ashford's humiliating retreat. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the manor gates, tenant farmers and local villagers drawn by rumors of what had happened, curious to see for themselves whether the whispered stories held any truth. Edmund noticed them from the study window and felt a fresh wave of resolve settle over him. Whatever happened today, he intended to honor the promise he had made to Ilara the night before. The signing ceremony itself proceeded with careful formality, exactly as Ilara had described days earlier. Ambassador Castellan and Edmund each spoke the closing oath aloud, repeating the words together as their hands rested briefly upon the finalized agreement, sealing terms that would bring desperately needed trade and stability to Ravensworth's struggling estate. Lady Isolt and Farron stood witness alongside Ilara, whose presence at the ceremony drew far less scandalized whispering than it might have only days before, thanks to the ambassador's own public respect for her demonstrated so clearly the previous evening. Once the agreement was formally sealed, Edmund stepped forward before the gathered household staff, the visiting delegation, and the small crowd that had assembled just beyond the manor's front steps. "Before we celebrate this agreement's success," Edmund announced, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "there is another matter I intend to address, one long overdue in this county." He turned toward Ilara, who stood a short distance away, her expression uncertain as every eye in the crowd shifted toward her. 6 years ago, a grave injustice was committed against Miss Ilara Voss, when a coward fled this county after committing serious fraud, leaving false accusations behind that destroyed her reputation and her future. I have learned the truth of that matter directly from Ambassador Castellan's own household, who investigated the accusations independently upon hearing of them, and confirmed what many of you may have long suspected but never dared to say aloud. Miss Voss was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. Edmund continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. For 6 years, this county allowed a lie to stand unchallenged, and Miss Voss suffered rejection and scorn for a crime she never committed. I count myself among those who failed her, by never questioning the rumor myself, until circumstance forced my hand. I intend to correct that failure now, publicly, and without reservation. Miss Elara Voss is, and has always been, a woman of honesty and honor, and I ask that this county finally recognize the truth that should have been acknowledged 6 years ago. The crowd fell into stunned silence for a long moment, before scattered applause began, growing steadily until it swept through the gathered onlookers entirely. Edmund watched as Elara's carefully composed expression finally broke, tears gathering in her eyes as years of quiet, unjust suffering were acknowledged before the very community that had once turned its back on her so completely. Ambassador Castellan stepped forward as well, addressing the crowd directly. I wish to add my own voice to His Grace's words. Miss Voss's skill and honesty guided this negotiation from near collapse to success. Calderon owes a debt of gratitude to her, and I hope this county will finally extend to her the respect she has earned through her own character, rather than the suspicion she endured through no fault of her own. The days that followed brought remarkable change to Ravensworth. News of the successful trade agreement spread quickly, bringing renewed hope to tenant farmers who had feared losing their livelihoods entirely. Merchants who had once avoided association with Elara now sought her out for her knowledge of foreign customs and languages, recognizing an opportunity that her unique skills provided. The whispers that had followed her for 6 years slowly began to fade, replaced gradually by genuine respect earned through the events that had unfolded before the entire county's eyes. Edmund found himself seeking out Elara's company more and more in the weeks that followed, first under the practical excuse of continuing correspondence with Calderon regarding the details of their new trade agreement, and later simply because he found genuine enjoyment in her steady, thoughtful company. She possessed a quiet strength that had clearly been forged through years of hardship, yet remained without bitterness, something Edmund found himself admiring more deeply with each passing conversation. One afternoon, several weeks after the delegation's departure, Edmund found Elara in the manor's garden, exactly where he had first spoken with her honestly on that tense evening before the signing ceremony. The garden had changed since then, autumn giving way slowly to the first signs of approaching winter, though the space still held the same quiet peace it always had. The tenant farmers tell me the new agreement has already brought real relief to their households, Your Grace, Elara said as he approached. Several families have spoken of repairing homes they feared they might lose entirely. That relief belongs to you as much as to any agreement, Miss Voss. Without your knowledge and your courage these past weeks, none of this would have been possible. Elara smiled faintly, a genuine warmth that had grown more frequent in her expression since the county's slow acceptance of her innocence began to take hold. You give me too much credit, Your Grace. I disagree entirely, Edmund said. I have thought a great deal these past weeks, Miss Voss, not only about the agreement or the estate's recovery, but about you specifically, and the courage you showed throughout this entire ordeal, despite everything this county put you through unjustly. Elara studied him carefully, something uncertain flickering across her expression. What are you saying, Your Grace? I am saying that I have come to admire you deeply, Miss Voss, not merely for your knowledge of foreign customs, valuable as that proved to be, but for your character, your resilience, and your quiet strength through circumstances that would have broken many others entirely. I find myself hoping that our association need not end simply because the trade agreement has been formally signed. A long silence stretched between them, filled with something neither had quite dared to acknowledge openly until this moment. Finally, Elara spoke, her voice soft but steady. I find myself hoping the same thing, Your Grace, though I confess, after 6 years of rejection, I had grown unaccustomed to hoping for anything at all. Then perhaps, Edmund said gently, we might learn to hope together, rather than each carrying that burden alone. In the months that followed, Ravensworth's fortunes continued to recover steadily, strengthened by the ongoing trade partnership with Calderon that brought renewed prosperity to tenant farmers and household alike. The county that had once shunned Elara Voss gradually came to regard her not as a source of scandal, but as the very woman whose knowledge and courage had saved the estate from ruin during its most desperate hour. Lord Ashford, humiliated by his failed attempt to damage her reputation before the delegation, found himself facing renewed scrutiny of his own affairs, scrutiny that revealed troubling matters he had long managed to keep hidden, though that story belonged to another time entirely. Edmund and Ilara's bond deepened steadily, built upon the foundation of mutual respect forged during those tense, uncertain days when everything had seemed on the verge of collapse. What began as a desperate request for help in a moment of crisis slowly transformed into something neither of them had expected to find, a partnership built not on desperation, but on genuine trust, shared purpose, and quiet, steady affection that had grown stronger with each passing season. Years later, when new visitors arrived at Ravensworth Manor seeking trade or alliance, they would often hear the story told among the household staff. A story of a duke helpless before demanding foreign guests, saved not by wealth or status, but by a woman the entire county had once rejected without mercy. It became known throughout the region as proof that judgment passed too quickly, based on rumor rather than truth, often overlooks exactly the person capable of saving everything that matters most. And within the walls of Ravensworth Manor, where a joining table of bread, salt, and wine had once repaired a fragile alliance between two distant lands, that same table continued to be honored each year, a quiet reminder of the night an outsider's courage and knowledge turned near disaster into lasting success, and turned two guarded hearts toward a future neither had believed themselves capable of finding again.